So for the second part of Section 1, details more with the idea of dealing with the debt that Americans faced and the country faced after the Revolutionary War and then the emergence of the new government under the United States Constitution. So the questions that we're dealing with here are basically the problems and solutions dealing with those issues. So the person that's in charge of that would be Alexander Hamilton, the Secretary of the Treasury. So he was a very smart guy that knew a lot about finance and debt and all those other important things. And so he came to Washington with a way of paying down and working on this debt that had basically kind of ballooned over the 10 years after the American Revolution comes to an end. So I did hand out this sheet, so you should find it in your notes and everything else, but if not, you can just make it in front of you. And so along the bottom, we've got to talk about the various types of debt that were owed by the United States government. So we have different types of debt to different groups and organizations. So if you have time and you want to look at this, we did this kind of fun thing because we talked about the oath and about how back in 2009, during Obama's first inauguration, the Chief Justice kind of messed up the presidential oath. And so if you have the time, you can go back and watch this video. If you have more time, this is just a short one, they were so concerned that the oath wasn't said correctly that they made Obama take the oath again inside the United States Capitol. So that's what this video is. It's not an actual video. All you're going to hear is an audio recording. So you can follow that on your own. So let's get back to this. So here we are. So we're going to talk about the first types of debt down here at the bottom. So the first type of debt is the nation's debt, the national debt, what we refer to as the Confederation's debt. So that was the debt that was racked up by the United States while they were fighting the American Revolution. So on the other sheet that I handed out to you as a place to take notes is that just a place for you to kind of write this down so it makes a little bit more sense. So that's what that first type of debt is. The debt that we owed under the Articles still needed to be paid. Just because it's no longer under the Articles didn't mean the debt went away. The second one said about assuming, and this was a little bit more controversial. What happened was Hamilton wanted the states, all 13, to assume the debts that the states had created individually, but share them equally. So let me put that down here. So he wanted all the states' debts put together in one large mass pile and then share them equally among all 13 states. Now you can sort of see, if you did your reading, that were certain states that did not like this because they didn't have enough debt. They didn't have any debt. And so the idea of them basically taking on other ones were not very happy with it. But this was his plan. The third part of the type of debt was debt owed to citizens, and that was in the form of bonds. So we did this in class, and we talked about bonds that were issued that people bought to help the government fight the revolution. So let's say it was a $10 debt. Back in the day, if you bought a $10 bond, you paid half the price for it. You paid $5 for it. And so Hamilton's idea was to pay the face value of the bond. The problem is that some people decided that they had held onto those bonds for long enough and they had nowhere to cash them in. And so what they decided to do is these people, and it was a term in your book, these speculators come along and they've got cash in hand. And so they know the deal is that these people bought the face value of their bonds for half. So let's say it's $10, they paid $5. So a lot of these speculators would come along and offer them less, maybe $2, maybe $3. And the people sold them to these speculators. And now they were upset because these speculators seem to be profiting from it, because if we go to the last thing, is that he wants to pay all the bonds at the price that's on the actual bonds. And so let's say if you were a speculator and you bought it from somebody for $2 and it's a $10 bond, you've made $8. And if you keep doing that over and over again, you can sort of see how much money you'll make. So to answer a question of where that debt came from, it's basically, as we just talked, money borrowed to fight the war, payment to soldiers, and the idea of paying back those bonds. So Now that we've talked about this, we've now got to talk about his real plan on how he's going to deal with that. And so you should see keywords in there, but these are the ones we're going to talk about. So let's go through them one at a time. He's going to create a national bank, and a national bank is critical to his idea because not a lot of banks existed in the United States at the time. And so for the economy to grow, for people to invest in things, you needed to have banks around, and he felt that the best way to run it is for the government to basically create a national bank. So that was the first part. The next part, he's got to generate some money. He's got to have taxes coming in. So the first type of tax he's going to come in with is a tariff, a tax on imported goods. So as people from various countries around the world try and sell goods to the new Americans, he's going to place a tariff on that to generate money for the government. Last but not least, he wants to create a national tax. A national tax that's going to be on a product of whiskey. Lots of people drank whiskey, lots of people produce whiskey, and he felt that this was an easy way to basically make some money and also show that the federal government is in control of this very lucrative business and basically profit from some of the tax generated from it. So there, we've talked about his plan. Now let's do this next one. Why is there opposition? So in your notebook, hopefully you have this written down. If not, just pause the video and stop. There's opposition for a few reasons. So let's go through them one at a time. First of all, southern states didn't like it. They felt it was unfair. And the reason we've discussed, they had less debt. And the other reason they don't like it is actually a tariff's not going to help them. The tariff's actually going to hurt them because a lot of people in the South bought their goods that were imported. So all it did was make those goods more expensive. The next reason why people didn't like it is that the plan would reward speculators. These people that were doing some sketchy kind of business dealings out there in the wilds of, the frontier, and basically sort of swindling people, supposedly. And then the last one is that the idea of the national bank wasn't very popular either because, one, most people were farmers and they didn't really trust the wealthy class. They felt that this was Hamilton just sort of dealing to his own people. He was very wealthy at the time. He was very knowledgeable about money and banking, and he felt that this was basically just sort of self-serving. The other reason is that it was unconstitutional, they felt. The reason for this is that if the government could create a national bank, that should say it in the Constitution. It is not in the Constitution. But this is where Hamilton was very wise, and he was wise in that he said, you are correct. The Constitution does not say that we can create a national bank, but it also doesn't say that we can't. And so that was his kind of logical thinking on that point. So how are you going to get a compromise? How are you going to get people to buy in? So this is the way he's going to try and get that compromise reached, and that is he's got to get the South on board. The South is basically dragging their heels. They're not moving forward with it. So he's got to give them something. And the something that he's got to give them, the one chip he's got in his pocket is that the federal capital had moved from New York City to Philadelphia. And it would be in Philadelphia for the next 10 years. And they had to decide where the permanent capital would be. And so what he did was pretty much hold a meeting with Thomas Jefferson, who was leader of the opposition, and James Madison, and they worked out a compromise. And basically those men were Southerners. And so what he did for them was that he offered the location of the nation's capital. That would be in the South. That was the way they got the South on board. So as you look here, right there's the line. It's basically they took a chunk out of Maryland and a little chunk out of Virginia, and that would be the new federal city. That would be the new federal city. And so that's the way a compromise was reached. So just wrapping things up, we'll just show a few pictures here. Hopefully we've been to Washington, D.C. Yes, D.C. is District of Columbia. That really doesn't mean anything, but it is the official name of the nation's capital. And you can sort of see it, that there's the Capitol, you can see the White House and everything else. So hopefully you've been there. The reason why this is colored a different color is that it's no longer considered part of D.C. D.C. is just on this north side of the Potomac River. So if you did the worksheet, as we talked about in class, the linking past and present, dealing with Charles L'Enfant, the guy who actually designed the city, this was his design. So you can sort of see he's got these parallel lines of roads going this way, but of course it would all center around government function. So obviously one part would be the Capitol here, this large open grass area that they called the Mall. No, there were no like shops there. That's today where you have the Smithsonian museums. And then over here you have the White House. But you can sort of see these broad, long boulevards going this way, crisscrossing through. So Washington, D.C. is a planned city. So there is the mall that we were just talking about. And of course, Washington Monument, Lincoln Memorial, the Capitol, the various Smithsonian museums, and so forth and so on. So the other iconic, ones that we mentioned, they're a little closest up the White House and the Capitol, and the Washington Monument. And then these would be from the Smithsonian. It's the infamous Hope Diamond. You can sort of see Dorothy's red shoes from The Wizard of Oz. You can see various space capsules. This is at a different location. So here again, you can sort of see those broad, sweeping boulevards. You can sort of see the roundness of some of the streets. That's the one thing about Washington, D.C. that's unique, is that it's more, in some ways, European. You've got these large circles, and you sort of have these spokes that are the streets. They're not too common in most American cities, but definitely in Washington. So that is where we'll kind of end things here, and you can sort of see some of these images as we close out. So they do talk about L'Enfant in the book. They do talk about him, mentioning that he is the man who designed Washington, D.C., and there's actually a metro station named after him, and that's his final resting place over in Arlington as he overlooks the city that he designed. So we'll end it there.